Now to business with Yuko Fukushima.
Okay, Yuko, after the U.S.'s announcement about Iranian oil imports, we are seeing a hike in global oil prices. So what are the experts saying about where the prices are going from here?
Right. Well, one expert says OPEC will continue to reduce output, and adding to that, the political uncertainty in oil-rich countries, Venezuela and Libya. If we add that, we can expect prices to keep rising in the near future. But the latest developments is out of Washington. Officials there are preparing to end exemptions that allow some countries, including Japan, to import oil from Iran without facing sanctions. Now, this comes after Iran's economy has already been weakened by a sharp drop in oil exports brought on by the start of U.S. sanctions last year.
Today, I'm announcing that we will no longer grant any exemptions. We're going to zero across the board. We will continue to enforce sanctions and monitor compliance. Any nation or entity interacting with Iran should do its diligence and err on the side of caution. The risks are simply not going to be worth the benefits.
Mike Pompeo says the goal is to prevent Iran from obtaining funds it may use to destabilize the Middle East. The Trump administration banned its trading partners from importing Iranian oil in November after it pulled the U.S. out of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. But it gave some countries that rely on Iranian oil 6 months to end imports. Those waivers are set to end on May 2nd. Iran has called the U.S. sanctions illegal and the waivers worthless. Meanwhile, a foreign ministry spokesperson says Iran is continuing a dialogue with its foreign customers, including some European nations. The commander of the Revolutionary Guard's Navy is also threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz, a nearby waterway that is vital for global oil shipments. He says if Iran is barred from using the strait, Tehran will shut it down. Across the globe, reactions are mixed. Israel's prime minister supports the crackdown.
President Trump and the American government's decision to intensify the sanctions against Iran is a decision of very great importance. This is the way to deal with Iranian aggression, and this is the way to stop it.
In Turkey, a key market for Iranian oil, the country's foreign minister took to Twitter to criticize the decision. He says sanctions only serve to harm the people of Iran and that Turkey rejects outside interference in its relations with its neighbors. A statement from Saudi Arabia's energy minister says the country is closely watching oil prices and will work with other producers to ensure adequate global supply. In China, a foreign ministry spokesperson asked the country's relationship with Iran be respected.
The relationship between China and Iran is open and transparent, and thus deserves respect. The Chinese government is committed to safeguarding the legitimate rights and interests of Chinese enterprises.
Meanwhile, the U.S. Special Envoy for Iran spoke with NHK on Monday. Iran is an important source of crude oil for Japan.
We have had extensive discussions with the Japanese government at all levels prior to this decision being announced today. It is our policy to ensure that there is no interruption in supply to Japan or to any of our allies.
A further curtailing of Iran's oil exports could push up global crude prices, but the U.S. government says it is working with key producers to ensure there is sufficient supply. Now, looking at the impact on Japan from the ending of sanction waivers, while Iran has been seen as a major oil supplier to the country, accounting for about 5% of imports, wholesalers say they are now getting enough supply from other countries to meet domestic demand. JXTG Holdings, Showa Shell Secu, and other Japanese oil wholesalers stopped their Iranian imports in October before the sanctions were imposed. They resumed the shipments this year following Washington's decision to grant waivers, but the companies stopped the imports once again earlier this month, betting correctly that a waiver extension was unlikely. Japanese Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshihide Suga told reporters the government will consider steps to keep the U.S. decision on sanctions from affecting Japan's energy supply.
The government had held talks with the U.S. on the issue to avoid negative impact on Japanese companies. The government will exchange opinions with Japanese oil companies on necessary measures.
Japan's Minister of Economy, Trade and Industry, Hiroshige Seko, also downplay the significance of the end of waivers.
Japan has been reducing its reliance of Iranian crude supplies. Iran now accounts for about 3% of such purchases, so the impact is very limited.
Meanwhile, in New York, the U.S. announcement sent crude oil prices surging on Monday following a three-day weekend. Benchmark WTI futures temporarily rose close to 3% from last week, reaching $65.92 per barrel. That's the highest level in nearly 6 months. Analysts say if Iran cannot export crude oil, major consumers like China will have to look for other suppliers. They say that would heighten demand around the world for oil from other major producers.
Saudi Arabia is ready to boost oil production in response to tighter U.S. sanctions on Iran, but doesn't plan any radical moves. This after the U.S. announced a tougher crackdown on Iran, seeking to choke off the OPEC members' crude exports. Here with more details is Tina Davis, Bloomberg's managing editor for energy and commodities. Tina, always great to have you with us. So no wonder we are seeing these oil traders betting on higher prices. So where are you seeing those calls?
Well, I think what's been interesting today, we've seen the market reaction been much more muted. Yesterday, we saw Brent move 3.5%, which was the biggest one-day gain that we've seen almost all year. There's only one day that it moved higher. And today, it's much more muted as the market kind of digests the news from yesterday. And the news that they're digesting is, the Saudis, as you said, are being cautious. It was trumpeted yesterday that they would come in and offset. They're being very cautious about how they do this, and they have to be cautious because if you think about sort of they're leading this OPEC plus delegation of allies, they need to make sure that this production cuts they have in place from the start of the year hold until it's time to discuss them again, and they don't want to go beyond that. So if you look at the broader market, what you're also seeing is a lot of bullish signals in the shorter term. So if you look at, for example, the December contracts for this year versus next year, the premium there has widened, and that's an indication that traders are seeing that there's the chance for more short-term gains in terms of price increases.
Yeah, I mean, of course, one of the fascinating things about this, Tina, is always the question of how much leakage there is, how much in lockstep OPEC members are. And it feels as though that may be more true today than it has been historically. What degree of control does Saudi have over other OPEC members?
Well, it's also interesting. You're hearing people talk about whether or not the U.S. is now a member of OPEC, or this OPEC Plus alliance, given the recent actions. Look, you've had Russia as part of this group. They've been quite vocal in saying that at the end of the year, they weren't sure they wanted to do cuts. They were brought in somewhat reluctantly. Keeping them in line is going to be more difficult now, especially if, as the Saudis are proposing, they're going to be increasing output. The Saudis have been over-complying, so they have about a 500,000 barrel a day extra that they can still send into the market and maintain their quotas. The UAE has a little bit of extra as well. If they're looking to go beyond that, however, then I think it'll be harder to make the case to Russia that they should not also increase production, especially as they're going into the next round of meetings.
Tina, what about the view that some countries may not be willing to go along with the U.S. sanctions on Iran? For example, China is the biggest importer of Iranian oil, right?
Yeah, China actually took about more than 600,000 barrels a day from Iran in the most recent count. That's an increase from December where they were taking about 100,000. So if you think about the total amount of oil that they're taking in, this is a substantial import supplier. And if you look at Iran in total, their biggest customer has always been Asia. I think what we're hearing from analysts and from other folks who watch is that they don't expect China to go to zero. So while you may see other allies, South Korea, for example, Japan, adhering to these sanctions, China not necessarily. And also what's interesting is to think about China's now going through the turnaround period for their refineries. So this is when they perform scheduled maintenance for the year. So they don't have as much of a need for oil imports as they would have in maybe any other months of the year. So they may be able to import just a modest amount and be able to survive.
All right, we'll leave it there. Bloomberg's Tina Davis, always great to have you with us.
So this is how they're all trading at the moment. Actually, one trader in London told us at the BBC, everyone's a little bit lacklustre this morning. It's taking them a while to get back into the swing of things following a lovely long weekend with gorgeous sunshine. It does impact us all, doesn't it? So let's now talk a little bit more about the price of oil and why it's at a 6-month high. And that's because the US, the Trump administration, has announced that from May the 1st, all waivers when it comes to those who buy oil from Iran will actually come to an end. So that's companies like Japan, China and others who currently buy their energy from Iran. So sanctions, US sanctions on Iran will be in place in full from May the 1st. Let's hear a bit more from Mike Pompeo about this announcement.
Before our sanctions went into effect, Iran would generate as much as $50 billion annually in oil revenue. Overall, to date, we estimate that our sanctions have denied the regime well north of $10 billion. The regime would have used that money to support terror groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and continue its missile development in defiance of UN Security Council Resolution 2231.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo there on the news about oil sanctions, certainly as far as Iran is concerned. But will Saudi Arabia step in? Emma Lou Montgomery is here. She's Associate Director at Fidelity International. Emma Lou, nice to see you. Look, it's an interesting one, this, isn't it? So where Iran's supply might be choked off as a result of these sanctions, Saudi says, look, don't worry, we'll step in.
Yeah, that's right. They can see the negative effect it's having on Iran, but also on the potential global supply problem as well. So they've basically said, you know, well, we'll work here to make sure there is supply available to these countries that need it. And
Saudi has the power to do that. I mean, with those reserves, it can step in, and that will help stabilise some investor fears, won't it?
Yes, it will do. It will definitely do that. And also, it would be interesting to see if it has any effect on the price of crude as well. Obviously, that's been soaring, and it went up to its highest, I think, since November on Monday. So it'd be interesting to see, because that has been keeping prices. The idea that the supply is so limited has been keeping a real sort of, you know, making prices rise higher.
In terms of what else is going on this week, we've mentioned Twitter, we've mentioned Snap in terms of earnings, but it really is a who's who of the tech world this week in terms of reporting. Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, Tesla. It's a big week for news, isn't it?
It is a big week, and it's going to be very interesting to see what they come up with as well, because obviously all our eyes are on whether there is a bit of a global slowdown, and whether these companies are actually going to see their earnings slightly starting to fall.
And a really high oil price will not help a global slowdown, will it?
Well, no, definitely not.
We often see that those two don't go hand in hand, though, because one is obviously a bit of a lagging indicator, isn't it? I mean, where are we in that scale of things, and how worried are investors right now about where there are pockets of slowdowns? And I suppose the real fear is that all of those pockets join up.
Yeah, I think at the moment the oil price is sort of a separate issue to the earnings and the profits on that side of it. But I think people are cautious at the moment. Consumers aren't really sure, investors aren't really sure what is happening, whether companies are sort of reaching their peak. We're seeing oil go to new peaks. I mean, a company profit's going to new peaks. Are earnings going to start trimming back slightly now? That's the question that people want to know. And that we might get an idea of that this week. Once you see earnings from Twitter, they're expected to come back slightly, but profits are still expected to be buoyant.
Yeah, interesting insights, aren't they? Emma Lou, for now, thank you. Really good to see you. Emma Lou Montgomery there from Fidelity, but she will return to look at some of the stories in the papers a little later.